Hiya.
Hi.
I think there's
Thank
a
you for
lot of
coming.
I think there's a lot of mystery that about what casting is. There was even a recent documentary, Casting By, that was all about casting directors such as yourself. Let's start from the beginning. Your IMDb page is incredible. Besides doing, I counted about 40 movies with Woody Allen.
Right, something like that. I haven't counted either.
But the very first one is a tiny little movie that I'm sure some people have heard about, 1973's The Exorcist.
Correct, yes.
So could you maybe give the lead up of how you got into casting, a little bit about what it is, and how that ended up being your first film?
Well, I think like a lot of people who go into either the film or the theater business, as a young girl, always wanted to be an actress and participated in plays at school and so forth and so on. And then when I got to college, when it became more competitive and you really had to audition and compete, I realized I just didn't have the temperament to do it. I was so nervous about auditioning. And then I also kind of realized that I wasn't that good. It's an interesting comparative thing when you're in a play as a schoolgirl and you realize that the person playing the other, and I went to a girls' school, so I was playing the male part and she was playing the female lead, and I realized, wow, she's good, and I'm just good at memorizing lines. So anyway, and so I tried a lot of other things in the theater when I was in school, and then fortunately met a casting director on a field trip that my school set up. And I thought, gee, this is such a wonderful profession, because if you enjoy performance and you love actors and you're interested in how directors work, it seemed like the perfect kind of thing. And it really, I have to say, it really is it is such a pleasure. You develop wonderful relationships with directors, and basically our job is to fulfill the vision of a director, and every director is so different in terms of their style of filmmaking, but also in terms of how they approach casting. Some really enjoy it, some feel uncomfortable with it, some spend a lot of time doing it, some don't, and now, of course, in this day of technology, some don't even want to meet the actors, they just want to look at film. And so anyway, that's how I got into it. But fortunately, I got a job with a woman named Marion Doherty. The documentary Casting By, is that too loud? The documentary Casting By is about her. She was a real pioneer in casting. Casting had, prior to, I would say sort of in the 50s and before that, always been a very just organizational job of people who kept lists, and they would have very similar people in for the same jobs. I mean, if you look at the old movies, you can see that the actors would all play the similar parts in every single movie. And Marion was quite adamant and kind of set new rules, really, for directors. And she would say, I'm going to have, say, only 3 people in for a part, and every single person I have in it will be different from the other. And so they will be 3 different ways of playing the role. Nobody had ever quite done that before. And the director sort of had to get used to it, but then, of course, became quite dependent on her point of view, because she did have strong opinions and made a huge creative contribution.
What do you think the sea change was? Why do you think that she was able to influence the industry, basically? Because nowadays, I mean, there are many casting directors who do this kind of work.
Well, I think it, and funnily enough, I'm not enough of a film buff to really know exactly when the studio film went out of, you probably know more about that than I do, the studio control lapsed a little bit. But in New York, where Marion and I both lived, it was a period in the 70s where independent movies were really really flourishing. And a studio called United Artists, which was run by New Yorkers, financed movies for directors, well-known directors, and giving them a huge amount of control over the films, which had never really quite been done before. Also, we had a mayor of New York at the time, John Lindsay, who was the first person to really be very proactive in making it affordable to make movies in New York. It had always been too expensive. The unions were too expensive in New York, so everybody shot in California. So that sort of confluence of things, when I went to work for Marion for the first time in 1968, she was casting Midnight Cowboy for John Schlesinger. And, that ended up in the United States, not that many movies get X ratings, but it did. And that was a pretty groundbreaking independent film.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, 1973 was the first credit. The Exorcist. How did you get involved with William Friedkin's horror masterpiece?
I was working for Marion. I was working as her associate, and Billy Friedkin called her and asked her if she would let me cast it, and I'm not really even sure. I think there was it was a funny little thing. I think that he hadn't really liked working with her. They didn't get along. And I think he did it to hurt her feelings in a certain way, except she didn't really like him either, so it was okay, I guess. But at any rate, she was extremely generous and said, "This will be a great experience for you. You should do it." I had never done a movie by myself before. She was very, very generous to all of us who worked for her, and gave us a lot of responsibility, and would tell the directors, Juliet's going to be working with you, or so-and-so's going to be working with you. So she had built up our confidence in a certain way. So anyway, I went off to work on that movie and was terrified, just terrified. He's quite a large personality. And I was just, but of course I worked very hard, which is, I guess, the expression in America, the great carrot is fear, right?
So, if you could talk about what has changed from when you were casting that first movie. Let's backtrack. What exactly is casting? I mean, I think people have a certain idea that certain actors are hot, like you were saying, the old list.
Right.
We need a Cary Grant type, and so why not get Cary Grant? What is it you do? How do you go about? How do you approach this with the skill set?
Well, I remember one thing that Marion told me early on was that she always liked to read a screenplay before she talked about it in any depth with the director, because she didn't want to be too influenced from the get-go about how the director wanted the parts played, so that she could think about it with some freedom. So that's usually the place to start. And of course, our job in the end is to satisfy the director and to fulfill the director's vision. But you always hope that you'll be able to make a contribution or add some dimension. And as this is the first thing that is done on a movie, and everybody's sort of in a great mood, nothing's gone wrong yet, and everybody's feeling very positive. But it's the first time, and the director's heard the words read, and it can really influence the way the movie goes. I mean, it helps define how to tell the story, because a director could hear someone read and it would be very different from how necessarily he had seen the part, and so everything can kind of change. At any rate, so to get back to your question, so I read the script and I sit down and I talk to the director, and oftentimes you start sort of at the top with your leads, and in general, oftentimes you are required to get actors in the leads who the studio or the financial people feel will make a difference.
Commercially viable.
Right, they'll
stars.
bring people in the theater, and so usually you start out with a lot of discussion with the director. And I would say over time, one thing that's changed about casting is there's a lot of, used to be that when Marion used to do almost all the movies in New York, not all of them, but a lot of them, and she would basically work with any director who came to New York who asked her to if she liked the project. Now there's a lot of loyalty between directors and casting directors. So often over the years, I would work with directors with whom I had a very strong relationship. So it becomes a bit of a second nature thing. So you sit down and you really throw around ideas about who could play the leads and so forth and so on. And then you might say, well, if, say a part isn't necessarily the kind of part where you might want to look for someone new. Then I would, in the meanwhile, all day long, I'm meeting new actors in the hopes. This is what's different from the old days. I think that our casting director's sort of badge of pride now is to find new people, to find people who are going to be new and different and haven't been seen before. And I think that came out of New York in a way, that people from the theater who hadn't been in movies before, who would give your movie a look and suggest the location of the movie, give it a New York feel or an urban feel, or really create an environment. And so then we would set up auditions for the director, and of course a movie has to be cast within a budget, so you have to be realistic about who you're calling in. You can't just, call in people won't work for the money you have available. Because casting directors also negotiate all the financial agreements. And that's one of the trickier things that we have to do, and brings with it a lot of headaches, too.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned fresh faces, fresh talent. 1977, you cast a movie called Julia, and there was a young actress who had never before worked in movies. Great feather in your cap. You discovered Meryl Streep.
I put Meryl Streep in her first movie, we'll put it that way, because I said this earlier to somebody, but nobody really, Meryl Streep arrived full-blown in New York. When she graduated from drama school, it was like, wow, everybody just knew she was a seriously important actress. She was so great. She came to New York, and by the time she did Julia, she had done a couple of plays. So I was just, in a way, lucky enough to find the first part for her. But she's always very generous about it. But, she wasn't a secret to anybody who, was watching.
If we could talk a little bit more about the process, as far as, I'm sure it's hard to kind of quantify your instincts, but for example, a couple years before Julia, you cast Stepford Wives. Actually, you've cast both the Stepford Wives movies.
I
But
did.
but for a movie like that, for instance, something that is quite unusual for Hollywood, something that hadn't really, a story that hadn't been told like that, and characters who are not quite as they seem. What are the qualities that you look for? How can you kind of describe what it is that you're looking for, besides just they seem like they fit these characteristics?
Wait, could you let's rephrase that. Let's use something other than the Stepford Wives for a sec, because that was such a funny movie to work on in a way.
I think any movie that you've worked on, but
yeah.
I'm thinking for anything that's maybe. That is maybe more unusual, or something where there isn't necessarily a type or someone who seems like they would just be the right fit. What are those things that you're looking for to figure out, as you're culling through your list of your database?
Right. I see what you're saying. I'm sorry, I sort of missed it because I was the Stepford Wives
had that. Demystify the process
yeah.
a little bit.
Right. Gotcha. I would say that it's it's really almost a totally intuitive process. Having said that, I think that casting directors, as I say, really do enjoy performance and appreciate performance on a very deep level. And I love the theater. In a certain way, I think I'm probably more of a theater person, more theater trained than film. And I see an enormous amount of theater. And of course, I see a lot of film and television as well. So sort of an appreciation of craft, but that is controlled by instinct, if you know what I mean. So that you have an instinct. You literally, sometimes when you meet a new actor and they come into your office, you just sort of know right away, wow, that person's got something. They just really, there's something so alive about them. You have a sense that they'll fill the screen or they'll make an impact on the screen in some way, even if it's in a small way, by a look that amuses you, or but oftentimes on a larger scale, you know, you have a sense with actors that they take up some space that's sort of interesting to you. And then I think also the same works for what you were talking about, fitting the actor to the part. I think that's also intuitive too. When you read it, you can see it. And you can see it with a number of different kinds of people sometimes, but it just fits.
Can you think of any specific examples of those aha moments where, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with her career. I mean, if I just rattled off some of these, Close Encounters, Pretty Baby, Terms of Endearment, Network, Working Girl, among any of these films, were there things that, can you talk about that look, that thing that, you know, somebody walks into a room, anecdotally?
Right. I guess I'll talk about it from the point of view of, just even trying to think of what movie would be. I have to say that on Working Girl, for instance, I had, you know, Melanie Griffith came from a Hollywood family. Her mother was a well-known actress, but she wasn't particularly well-known, and she had done Smile as a teenager, and then she did Jonathan Demme's movie Something Wild, and I thought that she would be very good for Working Girl, and Mike Nichols agreed, and we flew her in. And this is interesting. What year was Working Girl? Do you know by any chance? I can't remember.
88, I believe.
88. I remember this was the first movie that I really felt the heavy hand of the studio. Before that, we had been living in this kind of la-la land in New York where, you know, all the directors who lived in New York tended to be directors of influence, and they didn't really have to answer to anyone like Mike Nichols or Woody Allen or Sidney Lumet, that sort of generation, Alan Pakula. And so they did not like that idea at all. Who is Melanie Griffith? You know, Something Wild was a fairly small film at the time, and I think I'd seen it before it came out. It maybe hadn't even come out yet, and we wanted to cast her. But, you know, it was so clear she was our girl from the get-go. And but then they sort of tortured us after that. They agreed to do that, but then every other, you know, it never occurred to me, for instance, at the time, that the part that Sigourney Weaver played so beautifully, that we would have to cast with a well-known person. And it was such an eye-opener that they said, oh, you really, you know, no, we have to put somebody in that part. We have to make up for. Oh, and initially, Mike sort of thought it would be fun to use Alec Baldwin for the part that Harrison Ford played. And he was brand new, but really talented. But then, of course, the studio wasn't too keen on that idea, so he took the second male role in the piece. But
besides that, have there been other things that have happened within the industry that have greatly influenced how you have to go about your job?
I think that I'm lucky because I think things have changed, and it hasn't. I mean, for the last 5 years, I've cut back a lot. I only work for Woody Allen, who makes a movie a year, but he's the only person I work for. So I don't have to deal with the bigger commercial movies, which now, I mean, there is I think we were talking about this the other day, but this rating system where actors actually have numbers in terms of what their bankability is. And that is how, it's determined whether it's kind of going to be good enough for a movie of a certain budget. And fortunately, I don't have to deal with that in the world that I work in. But yes, I think that's huge. I think it's very big now. And I felt that on The Interpreter, which was sort of the last very large, that was a large movie for New York, very big movie for New York in terms of budget. And the weight of the budget, we were always fighting the weight of the budget in our casting.
Well, Woody Allen's absolutely interesting, especially in the last few years, because he's been making all these movies abroad. Uh, how, let's talk about Woody Allen and your long collaboration with him. Love and Death would be the first one, 1975.
Right.
Tell me about meeting Woody Allen in the 70s.
Well, when Marion left casting, I had been an assistant on Bananas, so she had done Bananas, and that's how I met him. And then he went to California and he did Sleeper, and then he came back to New York, and he was going to do Love and Death, and Marion had moved on to producing movies, and I was like 24 years old, and Marion said, "Oh, well, you should use Juliet. She'd be great." And he is so shy. The idea of meeting someone new probably terrified him. So he said, "Okay," because he knew he could come to the same office and see the same faces. Then it probably made him comfortable. And I was so shy because it was such a big responsibility, and he was so shy by nature that I can only imagine that it was like super awkward. But he is such a nice. Funnily enough, I know he seems so neurotic to the public eye, but such a nice, easy person to work for. Very, in over 40 years, I've never seen him lose his temper. The worst possible thing can happen, and he'll say, "Okay, so what are we going to do? We'll figure it out." He's just really, really good-natured. And so sort of gradually, our relationship grew and our confidence grew. And now it's such a pleasure because it's kind of a year-round thing, and he talks to me about what he's thinking of writing and what he might do next, and so it starts early on, and it's become more than casting in a way.
So you maybe if you can talk about like how it is working with him. So like he'll call you up and just say, "I've got this idea. I haven't even written it yet, but I just want to bounce some ideas off you." I mean, is that
Right, exactly. And we'll talk about it in terms of if it's a good story, but also if it's a good next movie for him in terms of its placement in what he made last, or in his body of work, as they say. And and he also, the great thing about him that he is such a good-natured person, but he also wants honesty. You don't feel like you have to kind of be careful about what you say. So I could say, I really don't think that's a great idea, or I don't think you should do that next. And he wants to hear it. So that makes for a great dialogue. And it's such a healthy, he has such a good work ethic. I mean, he works incredibly hard, and he wants to really know the truth, so which is a great ability. His casting style is peculiar, in that he finds that a painful experience. So he doesn't spend much time at all with actors, maybe 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and everybody knows it now. So nobody's upset about it because he always says, "Well, they have other things to do. They don't want to spend all day here." I said, "Well, you don't know. They really would like to spend all day here." But he doesn't. He thinks, "Well, I'm just doing them a favor by letting them go soon." But he works on a very visceral level. He works very intuitively, and he'll just say, "Oh," he'll barely have talked to someone. He'll say, "That person's perfect."
So over these 40 or so films that you did with him, what's changed from the early days to now? I mean, obviously you've got this down to a science. It's he's banging out one a year. What has changed? If you can think of any
I
specific.
think what's changed in his case, I mean, the reason he started to shoot in Europe was that he was more popular in Europe, to be honest, and he got financing from European, private money, as well as European countries who were dying to have him make a movie in their country. So he decided to do that, and it was very effective. It was worked out well for him. But I think like everyone, he couldn't have the luxury of certain things. Back in the early days, there was one movie he made that he wasn't happy with his writing and this and that. And he made it. He shot it a second time, the whole movie a second time.
Which one was that?
September. And or he didn't like to shoot in the sun, so he would say cancel. He would postpone shooting certain scenes, and sometimes we'd lose actors, and that would sometimes cost money. And he can't be quite as indulge himself in certain ways, as I think probably no directors can anymore. So, but how it's influenced my work is that he doesn't really like to read actors, and I have to make him do it because we can't afford to make mistakes. Because early on, he would hire an actor sight unseen, and then he'd say, gee, this isn't working out. And I'd say, well, you know what? You got to read them. He doesn't rehearse. So you have to read them. So he now is good about doing that. He knows he really does have to know. I mean, and sometimes I'll say, well, you don't have to read this person because I know they can do it, and you can look at everything they've done. But it makes more responsibility on my job. I have to say, I think this person's a really gifted actor, but I would really like to hear what they're going to do with the part. I would really like to hear it, and I think you need to hear it. And he's good about doing that.